Hello, and welcome to the food programme. I'm Sheila Dillon. We're always trying on here to focus life's torch beam on the path to a better future through food. In this podcast, we're on the case in Wales. Can that country, with its smaller population, its unified pride, its Cardiff Parliament, teach us some lessons? Well, have a listen, see what you think. Good afternoon, Abergavenny, and thank you for joining us inside the dome tent, though dome rather undersells the gigantic flower-bedecked canvas that's been set up inside the walls of the town's grand ruined castle. I'm Sheila Dillon, and a presenter of the food programme on Radio 4. And today I'm joined by four characters who are all deeply rooted in Wales, people whose lives, experience and work are concentrated on bringing changes to this country's food landscape. And I'm not being poetic, but for a long time, the grandeur and glory of the Welsh landscape hasn't been reflected in the way that most food here has been produced. That's changing, and what we're about today is we're trying to understand how it's changing. For some people, Wales is almost a testing ground for fixing the food system. That could make possible bigger fixes in the wider society, to the poverty and chronic sickness, for example, that the Joseph Rowntree Foundation documented so powerfully earlier this year. So let's begin. Patrick Holden is a farmer, cheesemaker, campaigner, longtime director of the Soil Association, founder of the Sustainable Food Trust, and we sometimes forget, informal agricultural advisor to Prince Charles before the Prince got a promotion. Beca Lyne-Pirkis is a cook, broadcaster and writer who starred on the Great British Bake Off. Now she's teaching dietetics at Cardiff Metropolitan University and showing in her classes how food, health and culture are connected. Sue Pritchard is another farmer in Monmouthshire, not very far away from here. She's also chief executive of the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission, who over the last 3 years have conducted the biggest ever conversation. It really was a very big conversation about food, with hundreds of people meeting in groups all over the UK to talk about food and what they want from the food system. And finally, Carwyn Graves, a food historian and now campaigner. He's the author of what I think is one of the very best food books written in the UK in the last 20 years, Welsh Food Stories. That and his newest book, Tear, the Story of the Welsh Landscape, have helped so many of us see the food and farming culture of Wales in a new light. To begin, can each of you describe something you've seen happening in Wales that's radical, maybe even revolutionary, something that could be a secret ingredient in changing this country's food story? Patrick.
Well, I would say the most exciting thing that's happened to us in the last, a long time, happened last year when we were approached by the Welsh Veg in Schools project and asked if we would grow carrots again. We used to be a carrot grower for the supermarkets for 25 years, but then in 2006, they made it impossible for us to supply them because they moved all their pack houses to the eastern counties, and we just couldn't make it work, so we gave up. And then last year, the Welsh Veg in Schools project needs a carrot grow. Would you consider growing them again? And we said yes, and we grew an acre, and it's so exciting to be growing vegetables for consumption of primary schools in Carmarthenshire and Ceredigion. The day before yesterday, we had Year 4 from our local primary school, which our children attended, Ysgolodderri, with the head teacher, and they came and they picked carrots in the fields, and this is what they were picking. I thought I'd bring a prop.
Beca, what's your secret ingredient?
So nice link from what Patrick was saying, actually. I wanted to raise the subject of free school meals here in Wales, something that was agreed on in 2022 and was rolled out by September 2024. Now, as a specialist paediatric dietitian and lecturer, I think it's just hugely important that every primary school child in Wales now receives a free school meal There are issues still, and I know we'll talk about those challenges and barriers, but what an amazing thing that we can offer every child a hot meal. Some of them come to school without having breakfast. That meal helps them to grow and develop and help them learn. I think it's hugely important, and I think the next step now is to look at the nutritional value, linking nicely again to Patrick and his carrots, but looking at that nutrition that they're getting. There is a consultation that has just been happening over the summer that I know we'll be discussing later on.
Sue?
Well, I guess this shouldn't be radical, and it's not so much a secret anymore. But the thing that really excites me about working with the food conversation in Wales was just the passion of the people who wanted to be involved. People are longing to be asked about what they want from food systems, and they are full of brilliant, sensible ideas that ought to put some welly behind politicians to just deliver what people are saying loud and clear that they want.
Carwyn?
I think for me, and this is going to sound a bit like a stereotype, but quite honestly, the secret ingredient is having had the privilege of sitting in front of all sorts of groups and communities, and then them saying, we want this. It's a bit like what Sue is saying here, but that sense of community connection and local pride, dare I say, is very much still there, even when people don't know how to do it. I was in front of a group of school children in a working class community in Carmarthenshire on Wednesday, and they've set up a micro bakery run by primary school kids, and the whole community thought, why not? We can do this.
Okay, 4 brilliant things. Let's go back to the beginning. Patrick, what's getting in the way of these ideas being taken up more generally?
Well, there's so much positive to say about what's happening as has been shared, but I think it's also important to look at the barriers to change. So this is not me trying to be negative, it's more saying if this idea of relocalisation of sustainable food systems is right, then it ought to go to scale, and it isn't. So I suppose, to answer your question, I think there are 2 or 3 things in the way. One is that we've destroyed all the infrastructure which used to enable food to go to local people. The abattoirs have closed, the packing stations no longer exist. Just the simple thing of getting our carrots washed and packed is quite a major logistical thing. It's only been made possible because of the company that's sponsoring the Welsh Veg in Schools project, Castell Howell, and one particular man, Ed Morgan. He comes to our farm every Sunday to collect the carrots and take them into the cold store. And that might sound just a small thing to do, but it's actually crucial, because without that we couldn't do it. I don't think we've got the right enabling policy from the Welsh Government. I think it's better than the English version of the post-Brexit support scheme, but it's not yet good enough, so that's a big barrier. But maybe the biggest barrier is price. Ed was honest about how his company, which is the biggest food distribution company in Wales, is faced with this dilemma, which he can buy very cheap vegetables from Holland or even sometimes from China, believe it or not, at amazingly low prices, whereas our carrots, just to give an example, cost more. So somebody has got to foot the bill for the extra price. Current food pricing is dishonest. I mean, when we buy so-called cheap food in supermarkets, it isn't really cheap at all. It's a dishonest price because it doesn't reflect the damage done to climate or to nature or to public health. Whereas if you're farming as we do in harmony with nature and we're producing nutrient-dense food, employing more people, all the social benefits, cultural benefits, we're not getting a reward for that. So we need to find a way to reward people who are doing the right thing and penalise the people who are not. And I think until that happens, you can't get this to go to scale. One other thing I think is worth saying, we used to supply carrots to the co-op in Lampeter. This is a long time ago now, like the early 80s. They used to take bunches of carrots direct from our farm. Then they said, no, you've got to go to Manchester to bring them back to Lampeter. And the same with Sainsbury's. They took our carrots, but again from a centralised packing station. And Waitrose, here in Abergavenny, the Waitrose used to stock our carrots and our Havod cheese. They don't anymore. Same reasons. Their distribution systems are so centralised, they can't deal with small and local producers, and we have to crack that.
Beca, I mean, free school meals, I mean, that was a big hurdle overcome. What next?
Absolutely. And, I won't go into finance too much, as Patrick has discussed, but that is a huge factor. I think, going from some children having to pay for their school lunches and now nobody needing to pay, that's had a huge impact on the budget available to spend on food. But it's not just food, it's things like staff. So staffing in kitchen, there's an increase of staff needed in kitchens now, but also our dining halls in primary schools aren't fit for purpose. When you're sitting down to have a meal, that environment plays a huge part, and our dining halls in primary schools are used for everything. So from the morning kind of PE class to the afternoon session with a visiting drama teacher. So lunch times are squeezed. And now with more children having free school lunches, that's having a huge more effect. So children are having to rush through their lunches, like 10 minutes, that's not enough at all. So children are having these free school meals, amazing. Do they have time to sit and eat it? No. And so yes, it is amazing those free school meals are there, but we need to look wider now. How can we make those lunchtime experiences better for our children? Not only nutritious, obviously. And as I mentioned earlier, that consultation that's happened over the summer, the new recommendations, so looking at increasing from portions of veg from 1 to 2 on offer, having 6 different variety of vegetables across the week, 4 different fruits. Sounds simple, but it's something that needs to be done. So it's from the fresh produce from people like Patrick to frozen fruit and veg as well, plays a part in it, absolutely. And then there's the other factor around those children who have got sensory or restrictive eating patterns or anxiety. And that to me links back absolutely to our environment and what we create and what is available to our children, which I think we're failing, and I think we could do better.
So the hurdle is that local and Cardiff politicians don't understand those, we've got free school meal, what's the problem?
But we could look at secondary schools, something that only a small percentage of children have access to free school meals. Time is even squeezed more there. And so children there are reaching for the grab and go options, which are more often than not the healthiest options, because those healthy options aren't available as a grab and go. Something that my children do if they're going to choir or sport, then we're not supporting their needs for training, for performance, but for just basic learning and growth and development. So yes, we're doing something amazing, radical, something that England isn't doing yet, something that Scotland and Northern Ireland are kind of considering, but we could do better and we can lead on this so much more.
Sue, many of us who've looked at the videos of the big conversation know how deep the feeling is that people want to be asked and they want change. Where do you go from there? Why aren't politicians responding? Why?
Well, I think politicians still don't quite believe that people really do care about food and the whole of the food system. And perhaps it's because, although we've done that brilliant work with citizens around the country, not enough people yet understand how the food system actually works. So they don't know that it costs Patrick much more to grow a really nutritionally dense, healthy carrot. They don't know how tough it is for the free school meals take-up to really flow through to the kids that really need it. Did we know, for example, that in the poorest communities in Wales, the take-up of free school meals is the lowest? So there are all these kind of structural issues in the system that most of us just don't know. And because we don't know, we don't turn our attention to them, and we don't turn politicians' attention to them. That's the big job of work to do now. When people do understand how the system works, they're very often outraged that it costs so much more to eat healthily than it does to buy cheap junk food, that businesses, industry can line the high street with adverts for junk food around schools, that kids are targeted every day. And they're outraged when they find out just how much those big food corporations spend on lobbying government to persuade them to turn their attention away from these issues. So I think our collective job is to build that sense of outrage and to share that sense of outrage so that it makes an unstoppable movement for change for politicians to act on.
Carwyn.
For me, the biggest obstacle is at the level of decision makers' defeatism. And I'm not making many friends by saying that, but I spend a lot of time travelling around communities, talking to different sorts of groups. And I can think of many farmers I know in southwest Wales who were protesting a year ago against the sustainable farming scheme, against putting more trees on their farms. But actually, when you talk to them privately, they're interested in putting fruit trees and seeing how they can run animals between those trees. They want to just find ways to make things work. They understand things need to change. Same in communities, same in kitchens, same in schools. Teachers saying, why can't my kids in my community set up a micro bakery, like I was saying earlier? That's just a normal young teacher, no background in food and cooking, but she just felt we can do this. But then, too many conversations to recount with senior managers in positions of responsibility saying it's great that many, many schools in Carmarthenshire, where I live now, have got polytunnels, they're growing potatoes, the kids have got that experience. And then the senior decision maker says to me, it's such a pity that those potatoes could never be served in school kitchens. And that is what I would call defeatism, because the problem is all the lovely restaurants in this fine town of Abergavenny, where did the potatoes come from? They came from the ground. They were washed in kitchens. We have to get beyond these sorts of obstacles to an attitude that's actually more reflective of what citizens say.
So that's, what, sort of health and safety concerns, or?
Yeah, it's... I feel we've become used to systems that, as we all know, very globalised, very just-in-time, sourcing food from halfway across the world. And there's a lack of confidence there that probably is nobody's fault because, we've been talking about schools and school meals, but the elephant in the room there is also the curriculum. And there's an opportunity in Wales. We have a curriculum that creates space for teaching across the traditional subject boundaries. If we're talking about food and, let's go with potatoes, we could talk about the geography of it, we could talk about the history and colonialism, we could talk about the biology and health, we could talk about nature. There's that potential of putting something as humble as a potato in the middle. But who of us in school had that sort of education? This is an oil tanker, isn't it? It's going to take a while to turn around. But in Wales, the national curriculum gives an opportunity, and teachers want to do that and take that opportunity.
You've often mentioned the Future Generation Act because you think that's been crucial. Could you just explain? I think most people in the tent will understand it, but not on the podcast or Radio 4.
It's one of these things that's going to sound really dry. It's a piece of legislation that came in 10 years ago called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And it basically puts a legal duty on public bodies in Wales, county councils, Welsh Government, health boards and so on, to not make decisions that will negatively impact future generations' ability to look after themselves. And, that's not very controversial as an aspiration, but it's having an impact in the real world because you can say, well, some of these things that community groups and health and education bodies want to do are moving us in a direction that will help. Maybe not the current generation, some of this stuff is slow, but it will help future generations be able to provide for themselves in an era of food instability and global conflict.
So a piece of dry legislation somehow doesn't get connected in minds with what you're talking about, Patrick. Carrots, the real cost of food, those things are not yet being linked up.
Well, I don't think it's the fault of the Future Generations team because we hosted their away day last year and they're frustrated, I think, that there isn't more change happening. But I think Sue's absolutely right that we have to mobilise public opinion, and I think the secret weapon is children. I think we have to get all our nation's children to have a seeing is believing experience visiting a farm when they're young and at an impressionable age, and they can become a power for change. But I'd just like to make one other point, if I may, about what's getting in the way, and Carwyn touched on this. At that same event, we had a session called Everything I Want to Do is Illegal. And this is lifted from a book written by an American farmer called Joel Salatin, who wanted to supply local markets. And when he started to do it, regulation got in the way at every turn. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. In order for us to supply carrots into the distribution system in Wales, you have to have a thing called British Retail Consortium approval. To get that, you have to go through the most unbelievable regulatory barriers. And it's exactly the same because we make cheese, the regulatory burden on the small producers and the sustainable and artisan producers is unfairly draconian, and it's stopping the movement that we need to see spread. So I think it's a big barrier to change.
Well, it's a good link to my next question, which is really about why these changes matter, because we've not really described this. Because the food system is, for the first time, and you might say, Michael Pollan, the American writer, says it's the first food system we've ever had that's almost designed to make us sick. Sue, what do you see as the issues in Wales particularly?
So at the moment, about 25% of Welsh children are starting school already overweight or obese. And that's not the fault of individual parents. It absolutely is not. But at the moment, it's perfectly possible and legal to sell and promote profoundly unhealthy food, packaged up, making false healthy claims to the smallest of children, weaning foods, and foods for 2, 3, 4-year-olds. Poverty in Wales is higher than anywhere else in the UK. We have the worst levels of child poverty. We have the worst levels of general poverty. Nonetheless, parents are trying to do the very best. And sometimes you think you're doing the very best when you buy that brightly coloured package or that very palatable pouch because you know your kid's going to eat it. When our citizens understood that, the regulations that prevent that happening just don't exist. Again, they are outraged. And they say over and over again, where is the leadership amongst our politicians that protects citizens? And in the face of all of that burdening pressure of diet-related ill health in Wales, still companies are able to exploit that parental urge to do the right thing for their kids. Just needs to be dealt with.
I mean, a lot of people, especially us outsiders, look at Wales and they say, well, actually, the Welsh government seems to be standing up in a way that other countries within the UK are not. They published their community food strategy, the sustainable farming scheme. There are regulation to restrict promotions of unhealthy foods. They're in the process of updating food and nutritional standards for schools. So from the outside, you'd say, well, actually, they're doing a bit better than Northern Ireland, England.
And if I can come in there, just to bring that piece of legislation in again, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, the potential that has is for citizens and local groups to say, well, actually, one of the issues here is, again, something as dry as planning, but we have a tool that says, why should there be presumed consent for a new supermarket or a new fast food outlet or for big billboards that advertise junk food to children? Because the law actually would make us question whether that's going to stand the next generation in good stead. So we have that opportunity because of legislation in Wales that hasn't yet been fully utilised, but this is an open invitation for citizens to use it.
I think the first thing that all governments need to do is curtail the power of lobbyists. The reason that politicians don't take it seriously, for all the work that we're doing and other organisations like us, brilliant organisations and food businesses that are trying to do the right thing, the amount spent by lobbyists persuading government that the wrong thing's fine, really, leave it with us, we'll sort it. We're just outgunned, we're out-resourced over and over again. So we need transparency around lobbying activity, and then we need to curtail and end lobbying activity about something as fundamental as the quality of our food.
Beca. Beca, I was thinking, free school meals, but, these terrible statistics about, obesity and illness and, poverty. Yeah. How does that bear on what you're talking about, what your secret ingredient?
We can do all we can in relation to stopping fast food places around schools and kind of those large billboards. We're also fighting a huge fight against those who are advertising on social media platforms as well. The influence of social media on our younger generation is huge, and that's something that is, a bigger thing that needs to be looked at. We've seen, latest reports that the gap between most and least deprived is just growing still. 1 in 4 households are skipping meals. We need to do more, and we can do more because we are seeing that it's not quite reaching those who need it. And I think, again, linking back to our children, we need to be doing more to support them from that younger age. But that means starting with families, preconception, conception, leading through then, to make sure that they have the information there and the help to support them with those choices.
Which brings us really to the next question, which is about food education, because one of the reasons for recording this programme at Abergavenny is that there's always been this link here between deliciousness on the plate and ideas and political questions. And a central question today is about food education. I mean, food education is now an important part of what's going on in Wales. And Carwyn, that's really at the centre of what you're working on with Cegin Bobl.
Yeah, so we took the view, listening to what everybody else had done across the UK in this space, that nutritious food isn't enough. It needs to be delicious as well. And you need to make sure that kids own it at a young age. So if kids don't have the opportunity at home, for loads of reasons, to just take raw vegetables, bits of fish, all sorts of things that they may not be very familiar with at home, cook it from scratch, give them knives, give them heat. Children can handle this. You can train them. I have seen kitchens full of children shouting hot pan and so on and so forth. And we're doing this with schools in the education system. We're taking them through 6-week-long courses. And at the end of it, you get 8-year-old boys saying, I'm going to set up a chickpea and Welsh lamb street food business when I grow up, which is fantastic. And it's not just us. So I think the bigger point here is there's a lot of different charities, different community groups, and there's a space for us to come into the public sector education system, work with teachers, because, as I mentioned earlier, that new national curriculum in Wales has come in and given us the opportunity to say, this isn't an extra, actually. This is a part of what education means. And at the moment, there's a big project going on in Monmouthshire and ours in Carmarthenshire and 1 or 2 others as well. But that's impacting a few thousand school kids across Wales. And what we want to say is we know that parents would like every single child in Wales to leave school with full food literacy. And that doesn't just mean the Eat Well plate, nutrition. It also means confidence, joy, the opportunity to take delight in fresh, locally sourced foods that they've cooked themselves from scratch.
And you've also been helping... adults are not excluded. I know you've identified the fact that adults would actually like to learn to cook too.
Yeah, we gave ourselves a hiding to nothing by saying, let's not just teach the kids, let's work with the teachers, but let's also teach the parents. So let's do 2 things. Let's get the kids to cook for their own parents at the end of the course, but let's also invite parents in and do a family cook club. So we're working with Carmarthenshire County Council, and we want to scale this. We want this to happen everywhere in Wales.
Sue, did you see this hunger for cooking skills?
It's the thing that everybody mentions in all of the food conversations wherever we go. We need to know more. We need more education. We need it to start with our kids. We need it to permeate all of society. But actually also, they want to know how power in the food system is working at the moment. So they want to know that when they're being advertised food with that kind of message, it doesn't have their interests at heart. This is in the interests of those big food corporations that are trying to persuade them to buy things that are bad for them. So they want the practical education. They want to know how to look after their kids, but they also want to know more about the politics and the economics of the food system, so they know how to counteract that as well.
Beca and Patrick, Beca, you're teaching university students. Patrick, cooking's going on your farm. How would you two introduce more education? How would you do it?
Leading on from what Carwyn said, I've been involved with the Welsh Arts Council previously, going into schools to use cookery to help improve numeracy. Food can be cross-curriculum, and with the new curriculum, you've got the health and well-being element, so iechyd y lles, that ties in with home economics, so that skills there, but also nutrition is brought in there. And I think, it's great, this new curriculum, because we're seeing any university students who come to us who are from Wales, we see that coming through, but we can do more. It's just, how do we push for more? Is it more training and support for our teachers, which is probably it, because they're also under extreme pressure to not only teach whatever subjects they are, but to deal with a whole multitude of other problems. The younger we can get them involved, because what happens is that they inspire their parents, and the amount of parents I've come to me and then said, oh, they'll eat this now, they've tried this, and it's inspired us to do this family meal once a week. And so that's what we need to do. We need to provide that support in the early ages.
Well, I just totally agree with all the other panellists of the importance of food education and cooking in particular. But I also think it's important for children to know where their food was produced and how it was produced. Because you know the phrase, you are what you eat. It's the truth. And it's also in the case of an animal, it's you are what you ate, if you see what I mean. And that's really important. So what the cow eats is important because that will reflect on the quality of her milk or her meat. But also, the soil is the stomach of the plant, if you see what I mean. Plants don't have an internalized stomach, but the soil is their stomach. And changes in agricultural practice that I've witnessed over the 50 years I've been farming have no fault of the farmers, but they've forced farmers by economic pressure to farm in ways which have compromised the nutritional integrity. And I think all children should learn when they're at primary school and secondary school where their food comes from and how it is produced as part of the educational process. And then, so it's like if you're cooking food or ultra-processing food, it still leads to the question behind was, where did the food come from? So we need to know, and how was it produced? And if you go to a supermarket, and this is not...
But you've also, Patrick, you've also got to care about that. You can't ask those questions if you don't care about that.
Yeah, and I suppose that's where Sue's obviously right about the corporate pressure, the advertising budgets and everything else. But I think there's one thing which is more powerful than any food company or retailer, and that's us. Because we vote, so we can use our vote to mobilise politicians, because politicians only want to get re-elected, really. So if we say this matters to us, they will start listening. That's one thing. But secondly, if we go to a supermarket today and we want to know where our food comes from, how it's produced and who produced it, you'll go away largely with an empty shopping basket. So I think we need to put pressure on the supermarkets and the big food companies to make them realise that we care about this and that the provenance of our food, not just all the other issues we've been discussing, is really important. And I think that's could be the game changer, because let's be honest about this, farmers have become commodity slaves. They are producing food at or below the cost of production, and they have no idea, we have no idea, where it ends up, and I think that's what's got to change.
I wanted to just have a quick question about Welsh pride. I mean, here we are, we're at the centre of a great deal of Welsh pride, and as you come in as an outsider, you can see this. And, you know, there's a lot to be proud of in the food system. You know, there are all those products which have geographical indicators as being special foods. And this year, I think the Welsh Government, and maybe other years, supports the Abergavenny Food Festival. But do you think, and I'll probably ask just you because we're running out of time a bit, Carwyn, that Welsh politicians really get how important the food system? Do they go beyond the food pride? Do they understand its role in the economy and bringing back hope and in creating jobs?
I think firstly that pride is absolutely there when it comes to food. And let me give two examples. One of them is lava bread, which I'd better explain for people who don't know what it is. It's seaweed that gets boiled down for hours. You can spread it on toast or whatever. Sales of lava bread are higher than they've ever been. And this is among young people. And that, what's true of lava bread is true of many other traditional products. And I can be in village halls here, there, and everywhere, and people want to talk about cawl, they want to talk about potato and bacon dishes, they want to talk about lava bread. But if I'm talking with decision makers, then that's just a little bit embarrassing for some reason. So there's something strange there when it comes to pride and our relationship with our own food culture. Just outside this dome, there's a stand round the corner doing Caribbean food, and they've advertised themselves as, let's spice up the valleys. For me, that's just a fusion of local pride, we're on the edge of the Welsh valleys here, and food from around the world. So on a cultural level, I don't think there's a problem, because people own it. But when it comes to then moving beyond that idea that this is just a little bit trivial, this is fine for St. David's Day, but not for every day, I think that's where the issue is.
Before we go to the audience, what might a food system in Wales look like 10 years from now if more of the ideas that you've all talked about were built into the system with political support and financial support? Patrick?
I think we need to set targets for the percentage of the food that we eat to come from Wales and produced in ways which are good for planetary nature and human health. and then hold ourselves accountable, whether it's politicians or the people in the food system, for meeting those targets. If we set that framework, that could bring about the change we need.
The head of Marks and Spencer's Food asked the government to set that number last week.
Yes, that's an interesting point about the food companies, because they actually need, in a weird way, they need our help. They're slaves to giving people cheap food, and if they get the right incentives and messages, they could change.
And in fact, 70% of Welsh consumers told YouGov only a few months ago they were willing to pay a little bit more for Welsh produce.
Becca, what, 10 years' time?
What I'd like to see in 10 years' time is that the health of the nation is starting to kind of reverse back, and that it's linked back to how we are looking at that nutrition and provision to our primary school children, but also the awareness around chronic conditions and how our health affects that. Those stats are just scary. Just stop and kind of reverse it back. That's what I'd like to see.
Well, we asked citizens that question, and they told us exactly what they want. They want a government to take food seriously. They want a focus on local and sustainable food production. They want support for farmers and financial support for farming more sustainably. And they want to see far fewer ultra-processed foods all around them.
Carwyn, 10 years, what could it look like if we got some political and financial support?
You talked about the Welsh landscape, Sheila. I think one of the things it would look like would be to drive around or maybe cycle around the Welsh landscape, and for farms, once again, wherever they want to be community hubs where people feel their ownership, they visit the farm, they know the farmer, they might even be volunteering for health and well-being, mental health on a veg patch that's actually producing food that goes straight into a local school.
Great. Okay, now we need good examples of what you in this marvellous audience have seen.
Thank you. I'm Nikki. I'm from an organisation called Size of Wales. What we've been doing, we've been looking at the global impact of that food system. So the impact on tropical forests, deforestation, the answers are all the same. To cut our reliance on imported deforestation, which is decimating tropical forests, that's bad for everyone in the world. We need better production at home. We need shorter supply chains. And we've also worked with kids. They've showed unbelievable creativity. They've audited their school dinner menus. They looked for that forest risk. And then they reimagined some of those meals. So last year at Abergavenny Food Festival, they were on a stage with Kate Humble, and they had brought a deforestation-free chickpea korma to the tent. And the really exciting part, they took their campaign to the council, to Monmouthshire County Council, and they explained their concerns that the items we're eating all the time, without realising that that is linked to tropical deforestation. They said, let's tackle this one meal at a time. And Monmouthshire County Council had the courage to put their dish onto their council menu. So that's something that these guys here formulated, is now something that they're eating in primary schools. And I think that is a real glimpse of a future food system.
Thank you very much.
Hello, my name's Sian Taylor. I'm also a dietitian, so it's lovely to hear you speaking. I work with children with eating disorders and sensory sensitivity around food. And I was really interested in what Carwyn was saying, because I think the really important thing is to move away from the healthy eating message. And I know that probably sounds really controversial as a dietitian. But what I mean is, let's have a much healthier relationship with food and encourage that much broader thinking about food, so we're not making people feel guilty. We shouldn't be talking about good foods and bad foods. We shouldn't be asking 2- and 3-year-olds to put chocolate in one basket as a bad food and apples in another basket as a good food. I just think children need to be food explorers, know where the food's coming from, be interested in the taste. And I worked with a little girl who didn't eat potatoes. She grew a potato in school, brought it home. It's taken them 6 months, but she is now at least peeling the potato, letting mum cook a potato and opening up potatoes. She won't eat potatoes for a long time probably, but at least she knows a bit more about them and there's an in the conversation.
That's a very important point. Thanks very much. In the front row here.
I'm Alan Heeks. I'm involved with a project called the Our Food Trust, and there's a really exciting pilot project for increasing local food production happening in Paris. We've been very impressed that Paris County Council very quickly offered a lease on one of the farms they own, And they've also modified their planning policies to enable dwellings for smallholder growers to actually get started up. And within 8 months, this project is now in production with young smallholders producing food for their local community.
Wow. I mean, I'm struck by this. We do try and not use this word healthy on the food programme because it's disastrous. I mean, we want delicious. But any of your responses to what we just heard from the audience?
I'd just like to pick up on what Alan Heek said in the front here, which is about county councils. I have a penchant for the boring, don't I? But I honestly think that county councils and more devolution of power to a local level, they're close to the people. And what I have seen is that creates the space for this sort of thing, really connecting up hospitals, schools, producers on a local level.
I mean, it's, I'm sure most people here will have heard of Professor Tim Lang's report earlier this year about food security, and we don't have food security. We haven't got a plan. And what came out of that report was everything needs to move to a more local, more regional level, because then we will have a secure food system. Becca.
I was just going to say, it's lovely to hear Sian's story about that little girl who, and I used to work with a lot of children with sensory issues with food, but those of us who have no issues, who would sit down happily and just eat whatever food and just enjoy every mouthful, there's a lot of children out there that even being in the same room with an item of food is really difficult and challenging. And so, the more we can work with other dietitians and county councils and schools to help make those environments better and easier for them, and just to kind of support them in that way is just lovely. So thank you for sharing that story, Sian.
Sue.
I am super proud of the work that the Size of Wales team and the councillors in Monmouthshire are doing right now to push some small grants and some funding out to work with local farmers. They are really, really focused on shifting the system in the period that they've got, and I'm super proud of them for doing that.
Well, our time is now up. What a brilliant panel. It's wonderful to hear the kind of energy, determination and intelligence amongst the food campaigners and communities and producers here in Wales. So Patrick Holden, Sue Pritchard, Beca Lyne-Pirkis and Carwyn Graves. And thanks to all of our audience, to the Abergavenny Food Festival for hosting us again. And if you want to join in the conversation at home, you can email us at thefoodprogramme@bbc.co.uk and find us on social media where we are at BBC Food Prog.
From BBC Radio 4, The Fort. Royal Marines and Army pilots speaking for the first time.
We felt there were Taliban fighters coming through this complex called Jugram Fort.
It was the most intense firefight I've ever been involved in.
The word gets around that 40 is missing.
The Apache pilot said to me, "You just need 4 volunteers. We secure them to the Apache wings and we'll go back and get Lance Corporal Ford.
Get me 4 Marines and I will take them in and we'll get that boy home."
Listen to The Fort on BBC Sounds.